Okay, we're at 6:32. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, if you're just joining, please drop in the chat your name and where you're calling in from, including the native land you're standing on, if you know it. And before we kick off, I'm just going to give a brief, I'm sorry. My name is Kathleen Callaghy. I'm with Defenders of Wildlife. I have Katie Burns here with me from Washington Conservation Action. We will be your tech stewards today. And before we kick off, I'm going to give a brief land acknowledgement. So we're broadcasting from Seattle, Washington, within the ancestral territory of several Native nations, including the Duwamish, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, Muckleshoot, and Stillaguamish people. The waters of the Salish Sea have connected Indigenous people in this region since time immemorial and continue to do so. We acknowledge the many injustices Indigenous people suffered during colonization, including genocide, forced removal, and cultural suppression, and the ongoing impact of broken treaties. We honor with gratitude the Indigenous nations and communities that continue to steward the Salish Sea to this day. And we will share more information about many of these peoples in this chat, and we encourage you to learn more and engage with tribal nations and Indigenous-led efforts in your region. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Rain.
Thank you, Kathleen. Hello, everyone. Happy Orca Action Month. We are excited and grateful to welcome you to our event, Legacy Toxics, What Orcas Can Teach Us About What's in Our Environment. Hosted by Defenders of Wildlife, Puget Soundkeeper, Toxic Free Future, and Washington Conservation Action. I am Rain Adamant with Washington Conservation Action. Today's presentation is one of many activities and events happening throughout Orca Action Month, which takes place every June. It was created to raise awareness of the threats facing the southern resident orca and learn what we can do to protect them. The theme for Orca Action Month this year is Lasting Legacies. We are honoring some legendary southern residents and marking the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act. Kathleen is dropping some links in the chat where you can learn more. And speaking of legacies, we are also want to think about the legacies as humans we are leaving to these whales and to our own future generations. One of the main threats facing southern resident orca is toxic pollution. Orcas are exposed to pollution and contaminants from our cities and communities. They are one of the most polluted marine mammals in the world, and all the toxic builds up in their bodies cause a host of health problems and jeopardize their survival of newborn calves. With only 73 individuals left in the wild, the survival of each orca is vital for this critically endangered population's future. Likewise, residents in urban neighborhoods like Seattle bear a disproportionate burden of legacy pollution, impacting their health and well-being. Tonight, we will hear from experts as they address questions like, how do toxics impact orcas and our communities? How big is this problem? And what can we do about it? Before we dive into the program, we would like to invite you to participate in a quick and fun poll so we as presenters have a sense of our wonderful audience tonight. Kathleen, could you please run the poll now? As you can see, we'd love for you to fill this poll out, and we will share with you the results in a couple minutes. But we want you to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 of whether you are have the knowledge of a 5-year-old or knowledge of a individual with a degree in this topic. We'd love to find out if you've seen an orca in the wild and whether you fish or gather food from the Salish Sea. Well, we tally the results. I'm going to introduce you now to tonight's moderator and host, Nicole Gladstone, who is the communications manager at Puget Soundkeeper, a nonprofit org whose mission is to protect and enhance the waters of the Puget Sound for the health and restoration of our aquatic ecosystems and communities that depend on them.
Thank you, Rain. Kathleen, what do you think? Oh, we got answers.
Woohoo!
All right, it looks like quite a few people, some have some knowledge of toxics, but they don't know all the acronyms, which is very fair. And a pretty wide spread of seeing orcas. And for those of you who said not yet, I can't wait for you to have that experience. I've only seen them once at the very horizon, and it was like so amazing. And some gathering of food those of you who gather algae, I would love to learn from you. And a lot of folks have never done it, but we have this amazing resource right outside our doors. Let's see, can I close the poll? Yes, I'm going to close this from my screen. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Nicole. I'm so happy to be here with all of you and with this amazing lineup of speakers. So tonight you'll be hearing from Daniel Parkhurst from Toxic Free Future, Dr. Deborah Giles from Wild Orca, Jamie Hearn from Duwamish River Community Coalition, Heather Trim from Zero Waste Washington, and 29th District Representative Sharlett Mena. And just a brief housekeeping note, we encourage you to use the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And it's 2 little speech bubbles with a Q&A. And you can write your questions in there and we will moderate that and keep track of it throughout the evening. And if some of the speakers are able to address your questions immediately after their presentations, they might do so. Otherwise, we'll collect them. We'll have time for a Q&A at the end. And tonight, with this theme of lasting legacies, like Rain framed for us, I really want to keep that in our minds moving forward. Like, what does it mean to have a legacy? For me, I think about the way the past informs all these possible futures that are always opening up in front of us, and how our actions today sort of move us from one of those futures to another. And we have these protective laws like the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act, but we also have inherited the legacy of pollution that humans have caused and that colonization has created in this region. At the same time, we have the ability to make change. So when we say lasting legacies and we ask this question, like, what can we learn from orcas? We're thinking about how our futures are really inextricably linked with these amazing animals. So with that, I'm very pleased to hand it over to our first speaker, Daniel Parkhurst, who's the organizing manager from Toxic Free Future, and he'll be talking to us about toxics in our environment. I'm going to ask every speaker the same question as I pass the mic. Daniel knew this was coming. For the rest of them, it's a surprise, but you have time to think about your answer. So my question as we transition here is, Daniel, what is your favorite thing to do in the Salish Sea region?
I would say it's a mix of paddleboarding alongside my wife, and sometimes we even take the pooch with us. She hates it, but it's adorable. And the few times I've been out there and able to see orcas actively feeding, it has been an extraordinary thing to see, especially the few times that I've seen it. The most recent actually was out by Orcas Island, and there was a brand new baby as part of not the southern resident orcas, but another pod. And it, after eating, was so excited, it started hopping up in the air. It was incredible. It was absolutely amazing seeing a baby orca just fully breach. So those two definitely. But with that, thank you all so much, everyone, for being here tonight. Again, my name is Daniel Parkhurst. I'm the organizing manager at Toxic Free Future. We're a nonprofit that focuses on scientific research, policy advocacy, and market transformation to remove toxic chemicals from our lived and built environment. And when we head to the store, we usually think that the products on the shelves are safe to use, that they've gone through testing to ensure their safety for the effects on our health and on the environment. But the harsh reality is that federal regulation just hasn't prevented toxic chemicals being used in products. It was true half a century ago, it's true today. And in too many cases, there are toxic chemicals used in production, in packaging, and in the products themselves. And these can leach out over time with serious negative effects on us, on our waterways, and on the environment. These chemicals of concern can come from both legacy chemicals, meaning those that are no longer used, but their impacts are still felt, and from chemicals in consumer products that we use every single day. Many of these enter our waters, work their way through the food chain into orcas, and many of them are of high concern because they are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. Chemicals that are persistent in the environment, meaning they don't break down easily. They bioaccumulate in people or wildlife. They just continue to build up within them and are toxic. Together, these mean that once exposure levels are sufficient to cause adverse effects in humans, domestic animals, or wildlife, their impacts just are not easily reversed. But what am I talking about specifically? Now, I should note, I am not giving you an exhaustive list, and we are not going through all of these, don't worry. But these are some of the examples of the toxic chemicals that impact Puget Sound. And I'm just going to take a couple of them as examples for really why you're going to hear from the experts and the policymakers tonight. So with that, let's start with a legacy chemical. Again, that's one that has largely been phased out, but that we still deal with. Polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, is the acronym that you'll hear often for this. They've been banned for more than 30 years, but they continue to make their way into Puget Sound's ecosystem. They were used as coolants and lubricants in electrical equipment, lighting fixtures, hydraulic fluids, a number of other places. In humans, they can have profound impacts on intellectual development. Children with greater exposure to PCBs have lower birth weights, slowed growth, poorer performance on tests. The EPA lists them as probable human carcinogens. Studies suggest that they're toxic to the immune system, reproductive organs, and the thyroid. So they're a major contaminant in Puget Sound, and they have been found at very high levels in salmon and in orcas. And the history of them is really a success story, but also a cautionary tale. Since they were banned 30 years ago, levels in our bodies have declined as they've been measured. And yet, we still face levels that could be causing harm. It's decades after regulatory action that we still face that. But we aren't just talking about legacy chemicals tonight. Toxic chemicals are still being used in consumer products that we use every single day. Many of these aren't necessary, and most of us have no idea that they're in the products in our homes, in our workplaces, and everywhere in between. Let's take PFAS, for example. You may have heard that term before. Per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are a class of chemicals, meaning that there are thousands of individual PFAS chemicals, but all are made up of a chain of carbon and fluorine atoms linked together. This class has been making the news for a whole host of reasons, like contaminated drinking water across the country well beyond that. And a major source has been firefighting foams, those that smother fires, but are washed into the waterways and the groundwater. But PFAS are also used in a huge array of products, from water and stain-resistant treatments, outdoor gear and other textiles, to non-stick coatings like Teflon, even our beauty and personal care products. And that's a teaser. Hold on to that one for later. Just keep that one in your mind. Now, nearly all US residents have PFAS in their bodies. There's a growing body of scientific research that have found links between PFAS exposure and a very wide range of health problems, including weaker immune system, cancer, increased cholesterol levels, pregnancy-induced hypertension, liver damage, reduced fertility, and an increased risk of thyroid disease. That's a lot of information. But let's take a breath after all of that. It's a lot of bad news, but let's look at what PFAS really means to you, to me, and to the people we know through a couple of more specific examples. Toxic Free Future recently, a couple years ago, did some research looking at PFAS and breast milk. Now, prior to our study, there really hadn't been testing of PFAS in breast milk in US moms in 15 years. So we really didn't know to what extent levels of contamination had changed over that time, especially as newer forms of PFAS had come into use. So we tested the breast milk of 50 first-time mothers in the greater Seattle area. We found PFAS in 100% of the samples, 100% of them. And it wasn't just those older forms of PFAS. Remember, it's a whole class of chemicals we're talking about. We found PFAS that were currently in use as well. And the levels of those were doubling every 4 years. The chemical industry had been promising that these newer forms of PFAS would not bioaccumulate. Our study showed it's simply not true. It's just not true at all. And it's an example of why PFAS and so many of these toxic chemicals should be treated as a class, not as individual chemicals because of the whack-a-mole problem that we're seeing here, but rather as a whole class. And we've also taken a look at where these are in our products. In 2021, we tested textiles to know to what extent PFAS were being used in outdoor apparel and where we find them in indoor furnishings like bedding, tablecloths, even napkins. We found in our testing that items that were marketed as stain or water resistance definitely contained PFAS. We found it in 72% of the products listed that were stain and water resistant. So all of that is to say, for these and for so many more reasons, PFAS and other toxic chemicals need to be banned. But it isn't just about stopping their use, it's also about ensuring that the replacement for them is actually safe. So an example of that and how it would play out. In Washington, we had an extensive contamination in the ground and waterways, mostly around our military bases, as a result of that PFAS and firefighting foam I mentioned. This is one of the big reasons that our state was the first to ban it in firefighting foam back in 2018. But what was clear then is that there was a need to move to a safer alternative. These foams, no matter what, are going to be widely distributed in the environment as they're used. And so to try and move the industry towards safer substitutes and not a regrettable substitute, Clean Production Action created the Green Screen Certified for Firefighting Foam program. It's a mouthful, but it's a program that ensures that foams on the market are known to be safer, that they've been evaluated for their safety to humans and the environment before they're ever on the shelf for purchase. Now, I've given you a lot of bad news here. It's a lot, but don't fret. Later on, you're going to hear more about how and why Washington State has some of the strongest toxic chemical laws in the US, and that they're based really around these principles that I've been alluding to, which is transparency so that we know what's going on, we know what's in the products that we use, banning the worst, taking those worst classes of chemicals and making sure they're not in the market, creating a hazard-based framework so that we know what is safe before it is ever sold, and then trying to incentivize the safest possible alternatives across the board. And a perfect example of that is Safer Products for Washington Act. This was passed in 2018, and the law is now actively working to keep toxic chemicals out of our products and our environment through government regulation. It treats toxic chemicals as a class. It focuses on transparency and the hazards and the safer alternatives for these. And I'm mentioning this in part because the first final rule was released in June of this year, just now. And by final rule, I mean, it's really where the rubber meets the road of how toxic chemicals are kept out of our products. But that just covered a set of toxic chemicals. And right now, tonight, the Department of Ecology is taking comments about the next set of priority chemicals to consider. It's a critical step to ensuring that toxic chemicals never end up in our environment and our communities. And Toxic Free Future has an action open right now to help you tell the Department of Ecology here in Washington State just that. We'll be dropping a link in chat if you're interested in taking action. It only takes a couple of minutes, and it makes all the difference for the Washington State Department of Ecology to hear from you about why it's important that they take action on these. So before I hand it back to you, Nicole, I just wanted to say one last time, I am so excited to hear from the rest of these speakers. Y'all have no idea. This is an incredible panel of experts and people that will tell you not just what this means for orcas in Puget Sound, but also how Washington is leading and what is left to do to make sure that we address these head on. And with that, thank y'all so much. And Nicole, I hand it back to you.
Thank you, Daniel. Wow. That was so informative. I'm really struck by the fact about breast milk and the way that toxics are maybe passed on to children. As I think about tonight's theme and the, critical situation with Southern residents and the disproportionate health burdens in our communities as humans, and that connection we have as mammals, even though we're such different creatures, that really struck me. So moving on from there, we'll go right into our next speaker, Dr. Deborah Giles, the Science and Research Director at Wild Orca. And Dr. Giles will be talking about toxic accumulation in southern resident orcas. Dr. Giles is one of the world's leading experts on the southern resident killer whales and currently monitors their health by collecting orca poop samples with Eba. Am I saying it right? Eba? Perfect. Eba, her highly trained scent detection dog, who might make an appearance if we're lucky. And Giles will take us through some of the ways that these toxics impact orca health. But first, I have to ask you, what is your favorite thing to do? Oh my gosh. Everybody stop and admire. I have to ask you, what's your favorite thing to do in the Salish Sea region?
My favorite thing to do is be on a boat with southern resident killer whales and have Eba have a strong hit on a scout sample, and that we are able to go and find it and collect it and send it in for analysis. There's just truly, it's crazy, but like me finding poop is, you know, my favorite thing. Having my team of people out there with Eba, finding these amazingly important samples, it's my favorite thing. After that, my favorite thing is to actually see other people. I'm going to put her down because she's super heavy. My other favorite thing is to see people seeing whales for the first time. There's just nothing like it, to be able to witness that and share that joy that people have when they see whales for the first time. It brings it all back to me, my first time seeing the southern residents, now 36 years ago. So I feel like it was 63 years ago, but yeah, so those are two of my very favorite things, as the song goes.
Awesome. Well, please take it away.
Thank you so much. And I do want to say, Daniel, oh my gosh, I was scribbling notes the whole time you were speaking. Thank you so much for all of that amazing information. It is in a way tragic, but it's also a clarion call for all of us to engage. So can you tell me if you can see my screen?
We can, Giles, you're good to go.
Okay, great. I actually can't see my screen, but I'll just wing it. So I'm Giles, I'm with the Wild Orca, and I am the Science and Research Director for this organization that has taken over this project from the University of Washington. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to be able to do this work and hopefully put new and very, very current science into the hands of policymakers to hopefully make a difference here. So that's my contact information down there at the bottom. It'll flash up there at the end as well. Okay, there we go. Nope. Not sure how to advance. Okay. So Wild Orca's mission is to translate science into action to save southern resident killer whales from extinction. It's no small feat, and I do feel an obligation and an honor to be able to try and do this work with so many different colleagues. I see many of them on this call this evening. Cindy Hansen from Orca Network. I work closely with Cindy and Casey McLean from SR3, among others here. All of the folks that are associated with OSA, Kathleen from Defenders of Wildlife, Rain from, I'm so sorry, I keep wanting to call it WEC. I know that's not correct, but anyway, lots of different partners all working and pushing in the right direction for these whales, and also some youth that I see on this panel, like Henry Roller. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your support and for pushing younger people, drawing them in, educating them, and getting them engaged. I do feel a deep sense of hope for going forward. So Wild Orca is a bit unique in that we don't just do science for science sake. We do science, what we call our conservation research. We have a three-pronged approach to aiding in the recovery of the southern residents. And so the first prong is, of course, our conservation research. This is utilizing a scent detection dog on the front of our boat to do this non-invasive fecal collection, where we can collect the samples and have them analyzed, where we're not stressing the animals out in any way. Secondly, the second prong to our approach is the strategic advocacy. And this is where we're taking peer-reviewed journal articles that sometimes might be hard to understand. We're condensing those into bite-sized and understandable bits of information so that the public and policymakers can engage. And then the policy engagement is actively seeking out contact with our elected officials to make sure that they have the most available science in their hands. And just in the last 2 days, I've had an amazing opportunity to meet with people from Patty Murray's office, Senator Patty Murray, Representative Rick Larson, and Governor Inslee's office just in the last week. And so these are opportunities to really be able to make sure that our policymakers who have the opportunity to affect change in a real way and in a quick way, to make sure that they have the best available science. But truly, the strategic advocacy and connecting with the public is what I think is really, really needed. And I'm happy to say that Wild Orca is trying to accomplish that with our action guide. So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So I was asked to kind of give Killer Whale 101 to set the stage for the next speakers. We're talking about one population, one unique population of animals on the planet. There's one clan, it's called J Clan, and underneath the umbrella of J Clan, there's 3 pods, J pod, K pod, and L pod. And what connects those 3 pods is their genetics. They're related individuals that have been they've been evolving over time, and in a place from Monterey Bay to Southeast Alaska as a group of individuals. They share a common language. They do not outbreed within their population. They only breed within their population. And they're just an incredibly interesting and dynamic population of individual creatures that make up the community of the southern residents. And sadly, we only have 73 of them living at this time in the wild, with Tokate, also known as Lolita, Scolioctonaut, is another name that the Lummi tribe has given her. This is another southern resident killer whale. So in total, on the planet at this point living are 74 individuals. So not very many, and they're highly, highly endangered. I love showing this photo, and I just recently received a painting of this image with friends of ours, twins, with J2 here rolling around in the kelp bed at Limekiln State Park. J2 took about 40 minutes, I think, if I remember correctly, to just barrel roll up the west side of San Juan Island, past all the spectators that were watching her. And this is just one of the very, very many amazing behaviors that these animals engage in, that help identify them as a unique population, and just gives all of this, all folks that have an opportunity to see them, gives me a thrill every time I get to see it. So hopefully some of you can too. So the southern residents are fish-eating killer whales. They only eat fish, and they preferentially seek out Chinook salmon. These are salmon that these whales co-evolved with over the course of tens of thousands of years, if not more. And that makes sense, because when you're talking about a massive killer whale that only eats fish, they had to have eaten a lot of food. And back when fish and whales were evolving in this region, co-evolving in this region, and salmon really creating the habitat that we see here, it made sense for this population of whales to focus in on Chinook salmon. The southern residence range goes from southeast Alaska, really all the, much farther up than this map shows, but the habitat that they tend to focus in on is kind of Queen Charlotte, Haida Gwaii Island up here shown in teal. And then just back to the designation for critical habitat, southern residents were given this dubious distinction of being listed on the endangered species list in 2005. And very quickly, the federal government listed the inland waters of the Salish Sea as critical habitat, as shown there in gold. And then it took quite a long time, all the way until 2021, for the federal government to designate the outer coast all the way down Washington, Oregon, and California as critical habitat. And last night I had the privilege of speaking on a panel for Oregon Wild. And the state of Oregon is trying to get the southern resident killer whales listed as a state endangered species. And so I strongly encourage anybody that has influence or voting power in the state of Oregon or even California to weigh in on this issue. It really would. It's a bit symbolic, but it does carry power too for the whales to be listed as endangered at the state level as well, as they are in Washington state. So when the whales were listed here in the United States as an endangered species in 2005, these three main identified threats were brought forward: lack of prey, vessel presence and associated noise, and exposure to toxicants, which is really what this talk tonight is about. When looking at it from a biological perspective, the biggest threat, the most important and dire threat, is the lack of prey. We're talking about the lack of abundance, number of salmon, but also the quality of the salmon. So salmon are shrinking over time. A lot of different reasons for why that's happening. That would be a whole nother talk. But suffice it to say, salmon are shrinking. The photo up here in the top right is showing at the turn of the last century, about 1910, two gentlemen holding up salmon that were caught in Astoria, Oregon, over 100 pounds. These are massive fish. They were called June hogs. These fish most assuredly were headed for the Snake River. Just another reason why we need to breach the Snake River dams to preserve the genetics of these wild fish. Now in Washington state, and I just confirmed this today on another talk that I gave and discussion I had with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the average size of Chinook salmon in Washington state is 12.5 pounds. So for a killer whale that has to eat hundreds of pounds of food per day per whale to just survive, that what it means is that in the past they could catch maybe 3 or 4 salmon per day per whale and have their nutritional needs met. Now these whales are having to forage for 20 or more fish per whale to have their basic biological needs met. And so that takes energy, it takes time, and it takes away from so many other things that these whales ought to be able to concentrate on. So with regard to the toxicant issue, when biological animals are eating and they're getting enough food, toxicants in the food web, in the marine realm with regard to southern residents, it's a bad thing. There's no doubt about that. The one silver lining, if you can find it, is that if there's enough food in the environment, even though that food is essentially polluted with persistent organic pollutants, as long as the whales are getting enough to eat every day, it is less of a problem. My kind of stupid joke, and I hate it and I need to come up with a new one, but it's like the one good reason to get fat and stay fat is that if you're eating enough, you're maybe ingesting toxicants, but it gets locked up in the fat stores. The problem arises when the whales are not getting enough to eat, or humans are not getting enough to eat. They start metabolizing their fat stores, and it releases those chemicals into the system, which creates a whole host of cascading negative effects that end up ultimately oftentimes resulting in early death. So wild orca, I'm going to super try and wrap this up. Nobody's given me the hook yet, but I'm feeling it. Our program, Wild Orca, goes out there. We try to find the whales and utilize Eva. You can see her here on the front of our boat, sniffing killer whale feces. We collect that information non-invasively. We can stay really far away from the animals, and Eva can still smell the scat sample. We collect it, send it down to our lab at the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, and out of that one fecal sample, we can get so much information. Of course, we know who it is because, you know, what species, because we're behind that species, killer whales or humpbacks. But the scat sample can help us identify the individual that has left us that sample. Also, things like reproductive hormones. Are the females pregnant? If they're pregnant, how pregnant are they? Or if they were pregnant recently, we can tell that too, that they've just lost a calf. Nutritional hormones, we can tell if they're getting enough food. We can tell if they're stressed out, stress hormones increase. But also more recently, we've been looking at other things like microplastics and the gut microbiome. There's so much information that we can tell from the gut microbiome. And then toxicants. POPs, persistent organic pollutants. These are chemicals, man-made chemicals that are in the environment, in the food web. They are long-lived chemicals. PCBs banned in 1979, 50 years ago. These chemicals were banned. DDT, which was a chemical that was used in agriculture, also banned in the 70s. 50 years ago, these chemicals were banned, and we still see them in the tissue, in the samples, in breast milk, in fecal samples of living creatures, not just southern resident killer whales, but humans as well. So it's a big issue, and I'm just so thankful for Toxic Free Future for the work that they do and the information that they can provide. Quickly, our studies looking at fecal samples have shown that 69% of the females in this population are losing their pregnancies. These are calves that are spontaneously miscarried, or maybe the baby is born but dies right away. We do see an amplification of toxicants, and this is because the whales are not getting enough to eat, so they're having to metabolize their fat stores just for basic biological functioning. Increase in stress hormones when the whales are not getting enough to eat, and all of this leads to early death and disease.
Giles, real quick, one minute warning.
This is my second to last slide. If you want to know more about what we do and how to engage, please look at our website, wildorca.org. And if you want to get engaged, wildorca.org.act. It's our action guide, and we walk people through different topics that they can get involved with. Thanks to my amazing team, Cindy Hansen, right there, a beautiful individual on the call tonight. Thank you so much for your work with us and with Orca Network, and all the other people that help make our work happen. Here's my last slide. If you want to get a hold of me, whoop, that was a little typo. It's ORG, not Oregon. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Thank you for linking that back to food and to the salmon. And I didn't know that about the way that the fat metabolism releases the toxicants and how that impacts like the abundance of food, and the toxics is all connected. As we move into our next speaker, it's making me think about how like maybe we don't have killer whales swimming up the Duwamish River, swimming up the watershed, but their food sources might be. And so as the fish and other food sources for both humans and other creatures pass through these waterways of varying levels of pollution, like it's all connected, and something that I've heard Helena Lopez of DRCC say, like the fish don't jump over certain parts of the river or jump over certain parts of the water. So that's really interesting and an amazing connection. So next up, I am so pleased to introduce you all to Jamie Hearn, the Superfund Manager at the Duwamish River Community Coalition. Jamie does environmental justice policy and advocacy work around federal and state level toxic cleanups. And she'll be showing us how this same suite of chemicals that we've been talking about, and maybe some other ones that are relevant to her talk, accumulate in humans and human communities, and the ways in which our neighbors and our neighborhoods in Seattle that are most impacted are advocating for solutions in their own backyards. And so, Jamie, before you begin, I'll ask you, what is your favorite thing to do in the Salish Sea region?
My favorite thing to do is go on picnics at the beach. I like to go to Alki with my dogs and just be near the water.
Awesome. Take it away, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Hearn, and I'm with DRCC, or the Duwamish River Community Coalition. And I'm here to talk about the ways that toxic pollution from multiple sources results in disproportionate health impacts, particularly in the Duwamish Valley. And so we can move to the next slide. So this is a lot of text, but it also comes from the cumulative impacts, or cumulative health impacts assessment. It's written incorrectly on this slide, or the CHIA. This was a study that was done back in 2013 to get some really concrete understandings of the ways that folks who lived in the Duwamish Valley or the South Park and Georgetown communities were, really facing some serious environmental consequences in ways that folks in other areas of Seattle and in other areas of King County just weren't. And so some of the most significant things that we learned from this study is that, the CHIA will be linked. So if you're interested in looking more into, exactly what the factors were and how this ranking process kind of happened, feel free to dive into that. I don't have enough time to go into that today, but essentially, a criteria was formed and some rankings were done of all of the different zip codes in the Seattle area. And the Duwamish Valley received the highest score of a cumulative impact score. So highest environmental pollution, highest health impacts, highest overall burdens, while the lowest score was found, to probably no one's surprise, in the neighborhood of Magnolia. And this results in some really serious, health consequences for folks in the Duwamish Valley. The Duwamish Valley is also home to the greatest number of contaminated waste sites and the poorest built environment characteristics of all of the different areas in Seattle that were studied. And it also was tied with the East Lake neighborhood for the most severe air pollution. And, it's one thing to kind of talk about the pollution that is happening in this area, but then to also understand, what does this mean for the folks who live here? What impact does it have on their lives? And through this CHIA, we were able to find that South Park and Georgetown residents have a life expectancy of 73.3 years, which ended up being 8 years shorter than the Seattle average and 13 years shorter than the average for residents who lived in a neighborhood like Laurelhurst. And so I just want to, kind of have all of these statistics. I know it's a lot of information, a lot of text, but it's really important to sort of frame the issues that these communities are facing. And so we can go to the next slide. And so similar image to the one that was in the last presentation. This is an image that we use in a lot of our outreach when we're trying to explain to folks about the consequences of consuming resident fish from the Duwamish River. And there is a lot of community members in the Duwamish Valley who fish and eat things from the river. There are fishing advisories that have been issued by the Department of Health that provide guidance on a safe number of servings for the different types of salmon species that are in the Duwamish. Generally, it's about 2 to 3 servings per month is considered a safe amount. And then any other type of fish or shellfish that's present in the Duwamish is not safe to eat in any amounts. And Despite this kind of outreach that we've really been working on along with folks at like the EPA who have a community health kind of program where they have folks who are from a lot of the communities that do fishing. There's been a lot of outreach, and any of these sort of public access points where folks can go to the river and fish, there are signs posted. But despite all of this sort of outreach work that's being done, we know that a lot of people, not a lot, people still fish in the river and still consume resident fish. And, this is for many reasons. A lot of community members in the Duwamish Valley are immigrants. They might not necessarily speak English at all, or if they do, it's probably not their first language. And so that's kind of where our work at DRCC comes into play. We try really hard to make all of this really complicated information accessible to community members in a way that makes sense to them and is culturally relevant. And so for a lot of community members, fishing is a way to connect with their culture. It's a way for them to provide food for their family at a really low cost. And, in communities where folks are predominantly people of color, are predominantly low income, the needs for something like fishing is a lot different than in communities where, they can just go to a grocery store and they have the money to buy salmon. There are no grocery stores in South Park. It's a food desert. And so we really take into consideration the needs of these communities and how sort of the unique circumstances that they have from living in an environmental justice community and being exposed to multiple forms of contamination shape the ways that they interact with their environment. And a big sort of point of concern that we have, we've talked about sort of biomagnification or bioaccumulation, the same process that impacts whales and salmon also can impact humans. And so when people eat too much fish from the river, those things like PCBs or polychlorinated biphenyls, they build up in their systems. And we had a really great presentation on why this is not great and why it can be dangerous to have large quantities of things like PCBs in your body. So that is sort of a main pillar of the outreach that we do. And I am going to move on to kind of a happier story of community advocacy and a success for our community. But I do also just want to emphasize, we're talking a lot about pollution in waterways, so in the Duwamish River. But, for folks that live in the Duwamish Valley, the river or the water is not their only source of pollution. A lot of these chemicals are also remaining in the soil. And they, King County International Airport is in the Duwamish Valley. All of the industry that lines the Duwamish River, creates air pollution. And so they are being exposed to large amounts of pollutions in multiple forms. And so I just wanted to highlight that as we kind of transition into a story of community success and advocacy. And so on the next slide, I have a picture of Duwamish People's Park. And it is a really beautiful space that was opened last year by the port. But several decades ago, this was actually the site of Malarkey asphalt. And one of the reasons this area was so contaminated was because the asphalt company had a lot of dirt roads surrounding it, and they would spray this kind of chemical solution onto the dirt to keep the dust from flying up. And in that chemical solution that would suppress the dust, there were a lot of PCBs. And so if you've ever been to Duwamish People's Park, and if you haven't, I highly encourage it. It's a very beautiful kind of public space that we have in South Park. But there are houses that are right along the road across the street from this park. And what that meant was that the soil that their houses were built on was toxic. They had to go and remove all that soil and replace it. There were some families that had gardens and they were consuming vegetables that were being grown in the soil. And all of that soil, including the soil that you see in this park, all of that had to be replaced, and new soil had to be put in. And so this was all being done as part of the Superfund cleanup process that is still happening today along the river and will continue to happen for several decades. But this property was owned by the port, and they were, thinking of what to do with this property as they were doing all of this PCB cleanup 20 years ago. And they decided that it would be a good idea to turn it into a parking lot. And so if you're familiar with South Park, one of the, many environmental injustices that we face here is that we don't have a lot of access to green space. Seattle is really renowned for its beautiful parks and the amount of green space per person that exists in the city, but that is not the reality of folks who live in South Park. And so community, of course, prioritized having a park, having a public space over having a parking lot because, that's not going to benefit them. And what they ended up having to do is DRCC bust in a bunch of community members to a port commissioner meeting, and community members were able to talk about why they needed a park, why this space is important to be open to community, why children in the Duwamish Valley really just need access to the river and access to green space and public spaces to come and spend time with each other and connect with nature. And it took a lot of community advocacy, but ultimately the port decided that they were going to turn the site into a park instead. And so it took over a decade for the park to be finished and open to the public, but it really was a community effort to get this space into what it is today. One part of our organization is the Duwamish Valley Youth Corps. And so it's not in this picture, but a little further back from where this picture was taken, there's a lot of habitat that has been restored, and our youth were really instrumental in planting native plants and doing a lot of the physical labor that is required to kind of restore this area. And now it's just this really beautiful public space. You can see the river, you have access to Mount Rainier. We have field trips there, and youth get to come onto the river. They get to see salmon in the river, sometimes for the first time. I was with a class the other week where we saw harbor seal, and that was so exciting for the youth. They live so close to this river and very rarely get to experience it in a way that provides enrichment into their lives. So it's really exciting to be able to have this space. And we've been talking a lot about orcas tonight, and a really important food source for the orcas, as we've learned, is salmon. Salmon come up into the Duwamish River and lay their eggs. And so restoring these wetland areas next to the river is really important because it provides really critical habitat for salmon who are coming back up the river to lay their eggs, or for young salmon who just need places to rest. And that's what this park has been able to provide for us. And so one kind of short story that I like to tell that I think is really cute and really fun. The local elementary school in South Park, Concord Elementary School, a lot of the elementary students actually get to do projects around salmon now. And so they get to raise salmon and release them into the river. And it's a really great way for them to do hands-on learning. And when I was on a field trip the other week, they were talking to me about the salmon, and they just know so much about the life cycle, and they understand the ways that all of this is connected to the health of humans and the health of orcas. But the thing that I thought was really funny is they told me the names of their two salmon that their class had raised, which were Taco and Taco Bell. And so I just wanted to shout out those two salmon that were raised by the students at Concord. But that really just goes to show how important restoring the river is, and making sure that the people that live here really have a strong connection to this place and to the processes that are happening, because all of these children who have gotten to learn about salmon and see how salmon life cycles happen firsthand, that's an experience that's really going to stay with them and inform the kind of priorities that they have as they grow into adults. And so that's a really exciting part of our work. And it's really nice to be able to kind of highlight a really positive part of the advocacy that has come from our community. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jamie. Wow. That is such a great story. I just laughed so loud at the salmon names. I'm glad I was muted. Thank you for bringing it back to the youth. And like, I'm thinking about how 20 years ago, before this park seemed possible, that this future that we are in now was like foreclosed, right? Like, how can we have this future where salmon education and connection to the river and like a healthy habitat and recovering habitat is possible? And yet now, because of the incredible effort and self-advocacy of the community, we're like in this world that didn't even seem possible. So maybe I'll cry before I introduce our last two speakers, Heather Trim and Representative Sharlett Mena. I'm so pleased to switch up our format a little bit and introduce these two in a little bit of conversation with each other. Heather is the executive director of Zero Waste Washington and part of the Plastic Free Washington Coalition. And Sharlett Mena is representative of the 29th district, which I believe is most of Tacoma. And I am so pleased to have you both here. Quickly, I will ask you both what your favorite thing to do in the Salish Sea region is. And Heather, I'll have you answer first.
Well, it's easy. I love camping. So I love especially camping when you're on the water. Deception Park used to be great, but now those growlers are going so low, it's not so great anymore.
True. I live near there. It's a little scary sometimes. And Rep Mena, if you let's see, do I see you? Yes.
I hope so.
Yes.
I'm on a handheld device, but hopefully y'all can hear me and see me okay.
I can. Thank you. And what's your favorite thing to do in the Salish Sea region?
Paddleboarding for sure. I was identifying with Daniel on kayaking, but I tried paddleboarding last summer and I'm hooked. So I'll say that's my favorite.
Amazing. Well, please take it away, as these two are going to be talking to us, zooming out a little bit from that hyperlocal focus to talk about solutions at the municipal and state level around how we get these toxics out of our communities.
Great. Well, I was hoping, Rep Mena, that you would go first and talk about your fabulous bill that you passed last session.
Great. I think I'm supposed to talk about two bills, but I'll talk about your
Yeah, okay, good. Well, why don't you start with the toxics and cosmetics bill and then talk about this one? How's that?
That's great. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be on a panel of experts that are really identifying, different issues along the way and different solutions as well. So the good news is that we can do something because we have each other, we have advocates, we have people who really know and really care and who are willing to put in the work to make a difference. So two of those pieces of legislation I had the honor and privilege of working on this year that came to me from advocates, including Zero Waste Washington and Toxics Free Future. So the first of those was the Toxics and Cosmetics Act. And Daniel talked a lot about how these toxics can get into our bodies, so the products that we use, and then get into the wastewater system and into the fish and into the orca. And so we really all are very connected. And what this legislation does is it bans 9 chemicals and classes of chemicals, including phthalates, PFAS, lead, mercury, things that we know certainly and have been proven to be harmful to our health, but are somehow and for some reason still on our shelves unknowingly for most of us. I know that I certainly haven't been reading the labels of personal care products like shampoo and conditioner because I assumed that they were safe to use. And so this bill will bring Washington alongside a couple of other states in the European Union and having strongest nations or strongest laws in the nation to ensure that when we do go to the store and pick up the things that we need for daily use, we are protecting ourselves and we are protecting our ecosystem. The second bill that I'm very excited.
Before you get to that, let me ask a question because I think the audience will be interested. Can you say a little bit about the formaldehyde fight?
Yeah, so no good bill that does good things for chemicals comes without a fight, especially from those that produce them and from those that, basically are worried about their bottom line, if I'm going to be perfectly frank about it. So one of those things that we decided to ban was formaldehyde, which is a known carcinogen, a cancer-causing chemical. But there's also a variation of formaldehyde called formaldehyde-releasing agents. And so these are slightly different chemicals that release formaldehyde, but are technically, quote, not formaldehyde itself. And so this was one of the biggest fights that we had all the way through the legislative process with folks from the Personal Care Products Council and some of those manufacturers themselves who, basically said, well, formaldehyde releasing agents are not formaldehyde and they're smaller quantities, so we should be allowed to perpetuity. And lucky for me, I have a lot of gumption and a lot of colleagues with gumption as well who absolutely not.
Uh-oh, did we just lose her? I think we may have just lost her, but it is so true. The fight that she led was amazing. She is a terrific legislator. Why don't I go forward, and when she comes back, we'll have her talk about the second bill. So I'm Heather Trim. I'm Executive Director of Zero Waste Washington, and we are in coalition with a number of groups, including several of the groups that are here, Puget Soundkeeper Alliance being one, working for in a coalition called Plastic Free Washington. Oh, here, she's back. Let me go backwards here.
I'm so sorry. My
We
mom
lost you.
called. Mom. Yeah, my mom was calling me. Okay, so we were in the fight, right, Heather?
Yes, now we're talking about 1085. I was just telling them what a great legislator you are.
Oh, that's really nice. Well, so to wrap up the fight, we made the case that chemicals that release formaldehyde are functionally the same as formaldehyde itself, which is a little bit of a no-brainer. But we had to really work hard to make sure that we got that in there. But like I said, with good advocacy and good partners and folks staying involved and being active advocates in the legislature, we were really able to accomplish that.
Okay, and then on to 1085.
Yeah, so 1085, one of my favorite stats that Heather, you shared with me during session that I'd love for people here to hear is that since 1983, we human beings have produced more than 85 billion metric tons of plastic waste, which is equal to the weight of 25,000 Empire State Buildings. And that is super daunting. This bill aims to take plastic pollution out upstream. Of course, we also have to continue to address pollution that is already in the stream, whether it's toxics or plastic, but prevention is one of the best things we can do going forward. And so this is the 3 parts plastic bill, and it's pretty well shown here on the slide. But one thing it would do is for any new construction that requires a drinking fountain starting in 2026, it would also require a water refill station. We're also banning little single-use plastics in many forms from hotel and lodging establishments, so that you'll see bulk things or things in cardboard, so that we don't have those little mini shampoo bottles and the like. And then the third piece is the overwater structures and making sure that there are proper guidelines for creating, thick and sturdy overwater structures, that these docks aren't leaking polystyrene into the water, whether it's for bad weather or punctures or so on and so forth. And this is a pretty big issue in terms of salmon and orcas. So I think this is a strong bill that's going to help move us in the right direction.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. And we're looking forward to another plastics bill coming up in the next legislative session. So let me go on with what I was about to show you, which is that I found this image. I was trying to get a good image that showed how plastics both interacts with the wildlife, but also with humans. So as you all know, we have more and more plastics in our lives, and as Mena said, it's been an exponential growth in the use of single-use plastics and other plastics around the world. And here you can see sort of all of the interactions that happen. So it's both going into us, and new studies come out every day on the impacts of plastics, even getting now into crossing the blood-brain barrier, which is a pretty dramatic thing that happens. If that's happening, it's also being seen in placenta. So the problem is that the microplastics are in fact getting all over our human bodies, and then of course into the wildlife. And in the food web, so this is showing just the aquatic environment in terms of the plastics and the microplastics, and circled are all the different places that you see the microplastics in the marine food web. So you have the microplastics, if you start on the left, you have them on the beach, but also coming out in the storm drains and coming out in the wastewater discharges. Then you have all the floating plastics that then start to sink, and fish and wildlife mistake it for food. And then it gets down to the bottom, and you see it gets down to into the sediments in the bottom, and then also then gets recirculated in the system. One of the things I think a lot of people don't realize is that you have the plastics, and as Giles mentioned, you're actually seeing now the microplastics in the poop of the orcas. That's pretty bad. But in particular, because there's toxic chemicals in the plastics, it's impacting the prey that the salmon and the orca eat. In other words, the little teeny fish that they eat are being impacted and may in fact not be surviving because of the endocrine disruptors and the toxic chemicals that are getting into their system. So you have less food for the orcas. Someone asked, why are the salmon getting smaller in the questions? So the salmon, the king salmon and other salmon are getting smaller for a variety of reasons, some of which is toxic chemicals, some of which is overfishing, and some of it is the loss of habitat. So it's kind of a combination of factors, and it is a pretty dramatic decrease in salmon size, not just Chinook, but all the different salmons. So this is a brand new report from the United Nations that is about toxic chemicals in and associated with plastics. And if you see on the left, you can see that the thing about plastics is that plastics are made of oil and gas. So they're fundamentally a toxic thing from the get-go. But then what happens is you have a ton of additives that are put in to make the plastic be a cup or be a bag or be whatever it is. And then you have other items that are added on purpose, which are often the catalysts and things that how the plastic is made. And then you have things that are accidentally added or come from the product themselves and then get recycled into new things. So the problem is that we have just this sort of cumulative impact of all the different types of toxics that you're dealing with. And here is, and I think this is relatively easy to read, and this is a little bit of a soup of chemicals, but these are some of the, these are the biggest known, but then there are other toxic chemicals that are actually in plastics. So the challenge we have is, how do we reduce the plastics? How do we recycle them safely? And how do we just get this out of our lives and out of our wildlife? And of course, going up the food chain to the orcas. So as I was mentioning before, we have a plastic-free Washington coalition. You can see the names of the groups down below, although this is back, the coalition has grown a little bit since the first bill, which was the bag bill. So this was led by Senator Doss and Rep. Strom Peterson to basically eliminate the thin plastic bags in Washington. It took a 2-year effort. And the next bill after that was 5022 that was led also by Senator Doss and Rep. Berry. And what that did are these 3 things. So if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, it bans styrofoam, but the proper name is expanded polystyrene, food service packaging, recreational coolers, and packing peanuts. The packing peanut ban goes into effect July 1, so in a week. And the other 2 go into effect 1 year from now at July 1 of 2024. If you look at the top left, number 2, it says that you can only have on request when you go to a cafeteria, a restaurant, a coffee shop, or even at schools. These must be on request only. Single-use utensils, straws, condiment packages, and cold beverage lids, or they can be out on the counter in a bucket. Number 3, if you look at the top right, is removing the requirement that you have to have the recycling symbol on the plastic packaging. And then the bottom, number 4, is requiring minimum recycled content in beverage containers, personal care products, cleaning products, and trash bags. So the idea is to create a circular economy, that you're making new plastic bottles out of the old plastic bottles. So then this past session, so this session only ended April 12th, a bill led by Senator Rothfuss and Rep. Berry is the WRAP Act, which is to modernize our recycling system and reduce waste. And it did not advance this session, but we got pretty far, and we are certainly coming back next year. Senator Rothfuss just got appointed to the Kitsap County Council, but Rep. Berry is going forward, and there'll be another Senate sponsor found. So what it does is 3 things. It's a producer responsibility for recycling system. In other words, the producers, the brands, pay for the end of life, fully for the end of life of the materials. So in other words, they pay for the recycling, and they're also incentivized to reduce it and do reuse. It had a bottle bill component, and then again, minimum recycled content for additional products. So again, that bill didn't make it, but it's coming back strong next year. Now, non-legislatively, some other things that we're doing to help reduce plastics in the environment is supporting local groups that do cleanups with standardized protocol that we worked on with EPA so that we can actually have apples to apples data and be able to list plastics and litter as a pollutant under the Clean Water Act. You can see here the 6 states plus DC that do have trash as a pollutant under the Clean Water Act in their state, and we don't have that in Washington. So that is something that we very much want to do here. And then lastly, we are doing some analysis of phthalates. So phthalates is one of those toxic chemicals you've seen on a few slides already. It's a plasticizer. It makes the plastics squishy. It's also a solvent that holds the fragrance in personal care products and things like that. It's a very useful chemical class of chemicals, but it is a human reproductive toxin. So we are working on basically sampling, and this is some of the sample jars, a bunch of different products for phthalates, and we'll be publishing that report later this year. So to conclude, this is a new version of a waste hierarchy that you may have seen before, but this I love. It's from the International Zero Waste Alliance. So for products, the first thing we need to do is rethink and redesign them so that you have less waste in the first place, or you don't have to even, it can be something you can reuse. That's the top. And then you go down to, after that, you do recycling and composting, then material recovery, which is basically using material for new things. And then only at Orange, landfill. And we put our dead bodies down in front of the bulldozers if they try to do waste energy and incineration, new facilities in Washington State. So love this new thing. And so again, I'm going to stop the slideshow here so that we can get to some questions.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Rep. Mena. So we're at that point in the evening where I'd love to have all the speakers come back on and we can open it up for questions. My collaborator, Katie, has been monitoring them. And let's see, should I just read them out loud? I'll read them out loud. So Giles, salmon size decreasing. So we started to talk about that due to overfishing. Heather touched on that. Did you want to add anything about salmon size?
Well, yes, but we need like 4 more hours. I think what Heather covered is a good kind of touchstone for the things that we need to be thinking about. There are a lot of other issues, but the things that Heather mentioned are actually things that are, strangely to say, easier to address than the other issues, even though they're massive.
Yeah, something that's jumping out at me is just the utter complexity and many moving parts, and you all work in different but related fields with different yet related approaches, and it all contributes to this question of getting toxic substances out of our communities and our ecosystems. And then also to Giles, do we think Southern residents might ever adapt to eat a different food source, not fish?
No, I wish. Myself and 19 other authors are just on the brink of publishing a paper about, it's a term I think I coined called phocinocide. So the killing of porpoise by fish-eating killer whales. They do seek out occasionally, not all the time at all. It's one of these fads that we're hearing so much about in the news. Fish-eating killer whales will find oftentimes a young porpoise and kind of play with it to death. But never in any occasion out of more than 80 instances that we've seen has there been a bite taken. Really what it boils down to is that we're talking about a population, an individual population of killer whales that co-evolved in this region alongside mammal eaters and shark eaters. So they're habitat partitioning in order to avoid conflict, most likely back, through evolutionary time. And so these are animals that have been eating fish, preferentially eating fish, co-evolving, eating fish over millennia. And what has happened is that, we humans have changed their availability of prey very quickly in the really the blink of an eye in the lifespan of a killer whale, a generation or maybe a generation and a half. So within 100 years, you know, these fish-eating killer whales are not able to make the living that they were able to in the past, and that they had been able to make, you know, work for them for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And so we're talking about like compressing, like, hey, you know, your food's gone, eat something else in 150 years, when we're talking about tens of thousands of years of these whales eating fish. So I'm hopeful that, you know, some renegade young Southern resident will take a bite out of a porpoise and be like, sorry, mom, but I don't actually see it happening. No, it's we humans that need to change our behavior, because it's our behavior that has impacted these whales to the degree that they're finding it hard to reproduce and live their lives in a very, very short amount of time. So it's not up to the whales to change who they are. It's up to we humans to change who we are, because we're the new people on the block.
And if I can add to that, we need to turn off the tap on the toxic chemicals going into the sound and the ocean. But fluorinated chemicals, I mean, that they have been around for 40 years, and we're now working on them now, and there's lawsuits. So there's a $12.2 billion settlement announced by one of the chemicals today for all the cities that have to do testing and clean up the chemical in our drinking water. But it is definitely a major problem for our food web, and we just simply got to demand that PFAS chemical get out of all of our products immediately and just turn off the tap, period. And that's true for all the other chemicals, but PFAS is the one that's like really kind of crazy making.
Yeah, here. Giles, what you were saying made me think of something that Jamie said about the effort that goes into outreach around fishing and shellfish harvesting, right? And like that it's not about expecting people to change their behaviors necessarily, because people have subsistence or ceremonial or other reasons that they have both the desire and the right to fish. And so actually, those of us who have inherited the legacy of the problem have that responsibility to find a solution, like Heather said. I'll read one more question out loud, and then I'm going to invite audience members if you'd like to unmute and ask questions, or if you'd like to write them, I can continue to read them. So last one that I'll read out loud, just so I don't overlook it. It was to Heather, wondering, is it ever okay to microwave Tupperware or other plastic takeout containers? What are we doing to ourselves when we
Don't do it. Don't do it.
it.
So there's one of the major researchers, and his name is escaping right now, on plastics, gave a talk at Town Hall about 10 years ago. And he gave this big old talk about, you know, his research. And then at the end, one of the audience members said, so what do you do about plastics in your own life? And that was the best thing he said all day, all the entire talk, which was, he said, as a plastics researcher and as a toxic chemist, I never, ever use plastic if I can help it, and certainly not heating up food in it. And because you don't know, they didn't know about bisphenol A. The talk was about bisphenol A. And of course, we didn't know about fluorinated chemicals and all these other things. I mean, the problem is we don't even know the toxic chemicals that are in the plastics and in other things. So what he said he does in his life is when he brings things home from the grocery store, if it's like yogurt, he would transfer it into a glass container. Back then, yogurt was mainly coming in PVC, which is polyvinyl chloride containers. It's less now. Anyway, he tries to have everything in his fridge and all the leftovers in glass or ceramic or stainless steel. He said and then like not getting, things in cans, because the problem is there's the plastic liner, which had bisphenol A. Now it doesn't, but it's something else. We don't really know what it is. So you should try to avoid canned fruits and vegetables as much as you can, and especially tomato sauce. And then what he said is okay is to have plastics for your things in the freezer, because the kinetics slow down. And so you don't have as much of a transfer to the food in the things that are very cold. So I thought that I immediately took him to heart, and I transferred as much of my kitchen over time, not immediately, but over the year, from plastic to glass containers with plastic lids and stainless steel, and basically just tried to get as much plastic out of our home as possible in terms of all that stuff. Do not microwave in plastic. Just don't do it. Or oven or anything. Nothing like that. or that French thing where you put the plastic bag in the boiling water, etc.
What about the dishwasher, Heather? I'm assuming the
Well,
same.
so that's the interesting thing.
Thank you, Mena, for coming. Thank you so much.
You got to go. Oh yeah, she's moving today. Thank you. See you soon. What that guy said that evening is that things like bisphenol A actually start to leach more the more used the plastic is. So you basically do not want to put plastic things, especially thinner plastic things, in the dishwasher. Better to hand wash them and use soap. And generally try to use the plastic as little as possible and get right over to glass and stainless steel for all your leftovers and things like that.
Wow. That is quite the burden on individuals, isn't it, Heather? It would be so great if we could just get the political will to get these products out of our homes. So I hope everyone on this call stays tuned, like Kathleen said, from all of our organizations about how we'll be pulling both legislatively and around community advocacy to make progress on these issues. As someone pointed out, if you raise your hand as an audience member, we can call on you if you'd like to unmute. And I'll just do a little time check that we've got about 8 minutes left. And I have one last question, round robin question for everybody as we close out. So I want to save like 1 minute for that.
Well, folks are thinking, Nicole, would it be all right if I asked a question? Awesome. I'm not sure if this is quite the right crowd for it, but most of our conversation this evening has talked about how, taking toxic substances out at the beginning of the cycle, right? And less about cleaning it up at the end. And so I guess my question for this crowd is like, what do we do about creosote in old, deck pilings or derelict vessels? Like how, what efforts are out there on cleanup that just can't happen any other way than us moving ourselves to take it out?
I think that's a Jamie question.
Yeah, I can at least talk about stuff along the Duwamish River. So the Duwamish River has two different Superfund sites that are adjacent to each other. So there's the Lower Duwamish Waterway and then Harbor Island. And so, yeah, exactly the sort of thing that you just mentioned. There's a lot of legacy pollution in the Duwamish Valley. And so basically all of the pollution that's come from the industrialization of Seattle and the formation of Seattle, a lot of it results in chemicals that are still in the water and the soil. There are docks that have creosote, like specifically like you just mentioned, and the Superfund law does require polluters to pay for cleanup, which is a really great component of the law. So it's not, well, okay, in Seattle's case or in the Duwamish River's case, the responsible parties are the city and the county. So I guess technically we are kind of paying for cleanup, but yeah, in general, a really great component of Superfund law is that those who are responsible for the pollution are in charge of cleaning it up. And so there are a lot of cleanup efforts that are happening along the river. If you're interested in learning more, EPA right now has a comment period open for the proposed plan that they've created for the East Waterway, and I can put a link in the chat to that. We have a whole page on our website about it that has links to the proposed plan document and information on how to give a public comment on that. And then for the Lower Duwamish Waterway, later this year, EPA will be putting out their final cleanup plan for the upper third of the river. So those are sort of updates on river cleanup. It's been, Harbor Island has been a Superfund site since the 80s, Lower Duwamish since 2001, and it's going to take several more decades to clean up. So it's a really slow moving and lengthy process, but a big part of our work is making sure that community members who live in the Duwamish Valley and live like right next to these Superfund sites are aware of kind of the developments in cleanup, and then also just making sure the general public understands, there are opportunities to plug in, because I think, a really important theme of this panel has been the ways that all of our bodies of water are connected, and the ways that toxic cleanup in, one really localized area can have impacts throughout the entire region. And so I'll put the links in the chat right now, but that's kind of what's going on in the Duwamish Valley.
Hey, Jamie, that was terrific. You might want to tell people where the East Waterway is because most people may not know where that is.
So the East Waterway is the section of water on the eastern side of Harbor Island. So there's, the river comes up into Harbor Island and then it breaks off into two different kind of separate waterways. So there's the West Waterway and then the East Waterway. And so they break up Superfund sites into what they call operable units, which are just different portions of the site that make it easier to do cleanup. And so the East Waterway is the last operable unit of the Harbor Island Superfund site that doesn't have a finalized cleanup plan. And so that's what this proposed plan is. And so once EPA collects all the comments for that, they'll come out with a final cleanup plan and cleanup can begin.
Giles, did you want to, and Daniel, did you want to build on that? And then we'll kind of bring it home.
I just wanted to say, Jamie, thank you so much for your presentation. I really learned actually a lot about the Duwamish. There's just so much great things happening. And then just for one thing, I didn't really realize that South Park was a food desert. And if people actually look up the term food desert, what that means, it's a very powerful thing. And it makes my heart very sad to know that that area of kind of South Seattle is considered a food desert. And then lastly, I just want to say that I have been educating students for a long time now. And it came to my attention at one point that actually in my evaluations, I kept talking about Superfund sites. And my students thought I was saying super fun sites. We're not talking about super fun sites. We're talking about super fund sites. These are sites that are like the worst case scenario that the federal government has designated of saying, these are the worst case scenarios. These are areas or situations that are the worst possible situation that we can have. They are, look that definition up. It's a bad situation that we have so many Superfund sites in the Salish Sea. And thank you all of your organizations that are focusing on these Superfund sites and educating people, educating me. This has just been a really, like I've got 4 pages of notes here from our talk tonight. I really am honored to be a panelist with all of you. So thank you.
I'll keep mine super short. First, Jamie dropped a link for everyone, if you don't see it in the chat, to a definition from DRCC of what is Superfund. It's really good, and it is really worth looking at. And I think the only other thing I'd add to this is that it is not easy to clean up. There is no single solution to get this out. And in many cases, the problem, the crisis that you face is so extensive. There is no real solution that we're facing in the short, medium, or in some cases, long term. And in a lot of ways, I think it's because we see these things as cheap. Plastic was cheap. It wasn't cheap. There was a cost associated, but you didn't pay it at the till. You're paying it now and you're paying it in the future, both in what we're dealing with and the human impacts and the cancer that it's caused. The #1 leading cause of death for firefighters, it's cancer, and it's because of PFAS. And in everything we're looking towards our environment and the cleanup long term. So sadly, there is no simple solution, and the cost is extraordinarily high, and we are all paying it.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. So as we close it out tonight, thank you everyone who's listening in. It's so wonderful to share this space with you. Thank you to all of our speakers. It is an absolute honor to hear what you have to say and to be adjacent to your work and overlapping with you in some cases. And then to my fellow organizers, thank you. We put quite a lot of work and time into this event, and I'm just so glad that it was meaningful for people. As a last question, we'll just like one sentence round robin. you know, with respect to the seriousness of Superfund sites, like what if they were super fun? What if they were resilient and healthy and clean? What does that toxic-free future look like, right? We have the power of imagination as human animals. So just shout it out. What does it look like, a toxic-free future?
I would say longevity for humans and orcas.
Yep,
I
healthy babies being born in humans, yeah, humans and orcas and everything in between.
Healthy fat babies. Enough food to eat.
I'd say one where I'm out of a job. I want this work to not apply. I want my nonprofit mission to be accomplished, and that be it.
If I can segue on that, I was going to say, so Washington already is a leader in the country on toxic laws, in a large part due to Toxic Free Future and the rest of the folks on this Zoom, and the Duwamish River Community Coalition, et cetera. So we need all of that action to just accelerate, and in the next 10 years, get all the laws and everything passed that we need to get done, and then we're done.
So once we all can retire, because we put ourselves out of a job, to me, it's like food for everybody, just food just spilling out of the earth for everybody, more than enough to go around. One or two more answers.
I was just with some 4th and 5th graders, and we asked them this question and had them draw it out on poster boards. And one that I really loved was one student had drawn massive salmon, like just giant salmon, and their explanation was, well, if the salmon are healthy, then they can get really, really big, and they will never be as big as the salmon that this child drew, but just the idea of having really like healthy fish in our river and in our oceans.
Amazing. Well, we'll let folks trickle out. We'll hang out until we kind of close out the audience. Please keep your eyes peeled for, yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Stay tuned for just a thank you email from us with links for actions that you can take, and some of the PowerPoints for you to refer to. And thank you again. You know, go out and create the, you know, the legacy that you want to live in. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.